Hi, this is Ken, and this is part 2 of a persona series. In the first part, we dived really into why personas are not being used. And in this episode, we're going to get a little bit more into the positive side on how you can make your personas more useful. Well, this episode is going to be called Make UX Personas Useful. Okay, so I'd like to start you off with a quote, and it says, "If you design for everyone, you delight no one." And that is a recipe for mediocre design. This quote comes from Alan Cooper. He's widely known for humanizing software design. And I really like this quote because it brings you into the feeling of how important personas are. So you get to a point in a project where you've done your personas, maybe they're in a deck, they look great, and you feel really good about them. And so where do you go from there? Well, there's 4 parts that I'd like to emphasize in some things and some ways that you can make sure that your personas are being adopted. So the first one is you really want to score your personas. So let's say you're with your business and they've already given you a lot of input on your personas, and they've given you feedback on whether your personas are realistic, and they really like them. But what I think you should do, even before and while you're creating them, let them know that after we finish the personas, we're going to score the personas. And when we score the personas, we're going to create a feature matrix that's going to use the scores to generate the weighting of your features. The reason why I think this is so important is it turns personas from being something that's merely empathetic to be empathetic, and causes the stakeholders to realize that this is actually changing the direction of the project that they care about. And it's also going to be sort of this proxy for how the features that you want to get on the board, how that they get sort of upvoted. So here you see I've got this kind of example, and this might be done in a physical room with stickies and things like that. But you got 5 personas, and there's Edward the executive, Spencer the special guest, Stacy the streamer, and Connie the content creator, and Vivian the video conferencer. So if I were to give somebody, and this might be printed out in a nice form, I would give each of the stakeholders a card that looks like this. It gives a summary of the 5 personas, and I would ask them to spend $100 or 100 points on these 5 personas, and to really give some consideration. If you think someone's the most important personas, don't be afraid to give that persona 50 points. And so when you do this, you're going to take all those cards back. You're going to go ahead and average those scores out. And what it's going to do is it's going to allow you to have a weighting of 23%, 50%, how many points that each persona is going to get. So here's an example of a feature matrix. You got 50 points dedicated to Persona 1, 30 points to Persona 2, 20 points. It adds up to 100. There's 3 features. And because feature 2 has, the most weighting, and actually feature 1 had some good scores for Persona 1 and 2, but the problem was for feature 1, that they got a negative score for Persona 3, so that brought them down. Whereas in feature 2, there's a 2 and a 1 and a 1, and they got a prioritization of 150. Okay, I have a little bit of cold right now. So here's another example. Here's a feature matrix, and you see that there's columns C, D, E, F, G, and I show you the formula down below. I'm pretty sure that you've had some experience with Excel, but in this formula, it kind of shows that you're taking, again, that score that each persona received, and then you're putting in, as you're going through, video lights that look like furniture. You're going to say persona. Well, I think that Persona 1 would give it a 3, and I think that Persona 2 would give it a 3, and I think Persona 3 would give it a 1. And so as you add it, then there's 148 points given. Well, the second feature, diffusers that look like furniture, you kind of see that there's a score of 300 points that's given, and that's the highest possible score that you can get. And then you also might have other factors that give you a decision-making kind of criteria. You got effort, and so could be that you have a combination of using effort, and you're also looking at how particular features are scoring along the different personas. So there you have it. That is something that's going to really generate some buy-in with your stakeholders. So now you got to the point where you've kind of gotten some engagement, and now you're going to want to do some more formal presenting of your personas, and you may want to use that scoring in your feature matrix, that initial pass. You may want to use that when you're presenting your personas. Something I'd like to recommend when you're presenting your personas is don't be afraid to present your personas 3, 4, 5 times. You might start off one in a small way with somebody that you know is maybe not a director, but that could give you some very useful feedback and might give you some input and let you do some fine tweaking on some things to emphasize. And then what you're going to want to do is then sort of go up the chain and maybe start, when you start to feel like you're ready and you're starting to feel like you've got the way to present these personas, then, start inviting directors and some higher level folks and maybe a larger audience, and then present your personas. And still, I would say after you've done that major presentation, feel free to present this again in another audience. It could be that you've got a cousin team. It could be with your fellow UX practitioners. You might also want to do this with some other kind of like related team members that are sort of partners, but they didn't get to hear it the first time. So don't be afraid to share them many times. The other thing is you can always find ways to evangelize them, and you can have information radiators. Here in this picture, I'm showing you that there's kind of posters on the wall, and but they don't have to be that formal. They can be just your PowerPoint slides, and they're kind of got the blue tape and they're stuck on the walls, and it's just there as a reminder while you're doing things. You can kind of gaze over at the wall and say, that's interesting. I'm looking over at Vivian right there, and I do think that she would value that, and you kind of bring these personas as if they were in the room. Because the whole idea of design thinking, the whole idea of the UX process is to take a user-centered approach and to take an empathizing approach, and your personas are there for you. Okay. So the third way to kind of make sure that your personas are before your partners and your stakeholders is you can use them in your design thinking and research. Whenever you're doing anything, just have a consideration. Should I narrow the scope of what I'm doing down to a persona when I'm doing an ideation session? So for example, when you're doing a journey map, let's say you got 4 stations, you kind of divide it up and you want to get people in the room. We'll start off by presenting your persona to the stakeholders, and this gives them a chance to get familiarized and refamiliarized with that persona. And as you're going through, you're kind of continue to remind them, let's be empathetic. Let's do this through the lens of Vivian, the video conferencer. Okay. And if you're doing an ideation session, I would say the best way to generate ideas is to really narrow your ideas. And so if you can narrow your ideas through the lens of one person, such as Connie, the content creator, and you've got these kind of 4 parts where you're going to want to try to generate ideas, whether they be new ideas for doing something, or they could be even generating pain points through the lens of Connie, the content creator. Okay, so the last point is really kind of a point, and it's also a goal, and that is you really want to refer to them very often. So, for example, you're on a project and you use user stories, and you might, have these user stories that say, as a user, I would like a bookshelf so that I can put my books on it. Well, if you do it through the lens of a persona, you might say, as Vivian, the video conferencer, I would like a shelf that looks good and is easy to set up. Another way is you're with your colleagues, and I would say this is the goal. This is when you almost know you've arrived. Your personas are being accepted, they're being used, they're in the vernacular, is when people just begin to say, do you really think that Vivian would want to talk to a consultant over the phone? And so when your personas have become part of the conversation, that's when you know that your personas are somewhat successful. And so all these ideas, I just want to point out that your personas might be great, but the problem is if they're not being used, if they're not being incorporated, if they're not being a proxy through your discussions and your thought process and your problem solving, your personas are not useful to the team. So anyways, these are 4 ways that can help make your personas more useful. Thanks for sticking with me.